There is a particular kind of fear that grips the hands of every writer when they return to a blank page that already holds too many ghosts. It's not the fear of failure. It's not the fear of rejection. It's the fear that the story you are about to write has already been written by someone better. That you're not creating something new, but repeating a shape that no longer fits. That is the heart of Dark Souls 2. It is not a sequel. It is a reflection. A story retold through fractured memory. A kingdom scribbled over the bones of a better kingdom, trying to remember what it meant to matter. It is the hollowing of narrative form, the moment a myth forgets its own structure and begins to wear its history like a mask. From the moment the game begins, Dark Souls 2 tells you that this is not the story you think it is. There is no prophecy, no calling, no throne prepared in your name. You are cursed, not chosen, and the curse is not destiny. It is repetition. An endless cycle of forgetting, rebuilding, reburning, a spiral of fire and ash and fire again, not to preserve life, but to preserve the illusion that life had a purpose to begin with. As a writer, this strikes something deep, because to create within a legacy, to build on the bones of what came before, is to enter a hall filled with the echoes of stories greater than yours. Every page becomes a negotiation. Do I honor what came before? Do I break from it? What happens when the structure itself resists my voice? Dark Souls 2 is that question rendered in world and theme. It is not just a story of a cursed kingdom. It is a story of a cursed narrative, one that can no longer sustain the weight of its own tradition. Where the fire is still lit, but the light no longer warms. Where the script continues, but the author has long since walked away. You begin in the things betwixt, a place without time. Not a prison, but a purgatory. Not a setting, but a placeholder. And you are not given purpose, you are given vagueness. A diagnosis. Bearer of the curse. A title that admits it doesn't know what you are. 3 old women that greet you do not offer wisdom. They offer ritual. Their laughter is not welcoming. It is mocking. You are not here to begin a journey. You are here to repeat one. Because that's all that's left. Repetition. Dark Souls 1 ended with fire or dark, choice or silence. But Dark Souls 2 begins with nothing. And in that void, narrative tries to reassert itself. Not because it should, but because it must. That's what the Kingdom of Drangleic is. A story that insists on continuing, even as its spine collapses. It's not a world in ruin. It's a world in denial. And every region, every character, every crumbling castle you walk through is another writer's hand trying to correct the margins of a page that is already burned. The Emerald Herald tells you to seek the king, not because you can save him, but because he tried. Vendrick built this kingdom to stand outside the cycle. He rejected the fire. He studied the curse. He resisted the format, and it broke him. Not because he failed, but because resistance was never allowed. Dark Souls 2 is filled with these moments, these characters, these literary echoes of failed authorship. Vendrick, who tried to understand the curse intellectually. Aldia, who tried to break the story open with experimentation. Lucatiel, who tried to write her name into her own fading skin. Every one of them a metaphor for creative collapse. They are not villains. They are not allies. They are versions of you, of the writer, of the gamer, at different stages of the curse. Because the curse isn't just on death, it's authorship. It is the inability to stop, to let the story end, to walk away. You are not here to save Drangleic. You are here to see what happens when a world, when a narrative, is kept alive past its final chapter. And that is where the horror begins. There is something terrifying about inheriting a story you didn't start. Because if it's beloved, you cannot honor it enough. And if it's broken, you cannot fix it cleanly. You're always writing in the margins, erasing someone else's heartbeat, adding ink where perhaps silence should have remained. That's the pressure that Dark Souls 2 carries from its first breath. It stands in the shadow of a masterpiece. Its mechanics, its myth, its very tone reverberating with the memory of Lordran. And yet it doesn't respond with confidence. It responds with confusion, with contradiction, with forgetting. As an author, I know that weight, the desperation to continue something sacred without defiling its foundation, the sense that your story must be worthy not just of the reader, but of the previous author. But what happens when that author is gone? What happens when the fire begins to fade, and you are left with only the cinders of a story they told? You try to rewrite it. You try to light the flame again, even if it no longer fits the world, even if the world itself has forgotten why it ever burned. And that's where Dark Souls 2 begins. Not in purpose, but in pressure. It is a story born from compulsion. The kingdom of Drangleic is not built with inspiration, it's built with obligation. And that makes it one of the most haunting narratives I've ever encountered. Because this isn't a world failing to live. It's a world pretending it still wants to. The people here do not speak with hope. They speak with habit. They recite lines handed down through ages of ash. The Emerald Herald tells you to seek the king. The old woman laugh and call you cursed. The blacksmith waits for you to bring him the key, as if it's something you were always meant to do. No one speaks with clarity. They all speak with the weight of repetition. And this is the game's quiet brilliance. It is not telling you to save the world. It is telling you the world is tired of being saved. Drangleic is not Lordran. It does not ask you to link the flame. It does not promise salvation through suffering. It doesn't invite you to become a myth. It simply leaves you in a world that has already done all that and failed anyway. And yet you keep walking, because that's what you were told to do. That's what the last game taught you. That's what Legacy demands. And in that motion, in that compulsion to repeat the shape of a story even when the shape no longer fits, Dark Souls 2 becomes a rare kind of fiction. A sequel that interrogates the very need for sequels. As an author, I can't help but see this as an act of creative self-harm. A writer trying to drag a dead narrative forward because they're afraid of silence. Because they don't know how to say, it's over. Because they need the fire to keep burning, even if the world is too far gone to feel its heat. I've felt that before, sitting at the edge of a manuscript that no longer speaks to me. Running fingers over the keyboard and hoping something stirs. Rearranging sentences that once rang with truth, now little more than echoes of an older voice that I barely recognize as mine. That's the quiet burden of continuation. Not creation, but conservation. And Dark Souls 2 is soaked in that feeling. Not just narratively, but structurally. The very geography of Drangleic is uncertain. The architecture bends with memory, not logic. You rise from a poisonous swamp and find yourself atop a fortress in a sea of magma. You step into a crumbling castle and emerge in a quiet forest filled with songs meant to keep the dark at bay. These are not world-building choices. They're emotional fractures. This is not a coherent map. It's a broken manuscript. Pages reshuffled, meanings blurred. FromSoft was not trying to lie to you. They were trying to preserve something they could no longer hold together. And like any writer haunted by their own past brilliance, they began copying the contours of what came before, hoping the shape alone would resurrect the magic. But magic does not survive mimicry. Magic survives memory. And memory, in this game, is a curse. Drangleic is filled with people who can't remember who they are. People like Lucille, who clings to her name like a prayer whispered too many times, who draws her sword not out of vengeance, but out of habit, desperate to feel something familiar before her identity fades completely. Or King Vendrick, who once defied the narrative, refused to light the flame, tried to chart a different path, to break the cycle of undeath through intellect and isolation. And for that, he was broken, hollowed, caged within a crypt, wandering in circles around a coffin that no longer opens. And then there's Aldia, the only voice in the entire trilogy that steps out of the myth and says what every author eventually fears. This story is not working. He's not a king, not a god, not a villain. He's a dreamer who woke up inside a book and began tearing out its pages. He does not wish to conquer. He does not wish to rule. He simply wishes to understand, to deconstruct the flame, to question the binary of light and dark, to ask in the quiet that follows a world-ending fire, why must we keep burning? Dark Souls 2 doesn't ask you to choose between good and evil. It asks you to choose between recursion and release, between becoming the next character in the myth or walking away from it entirely. And that's not just a player's choice, that's an author's choice. Because there comes a moment in every story where you must ask yourself, am I writing because I believe in this world, or because I don't know how to stop? There's a reason so many writers fear sequels, because every new installment invites comparison. Not just to the story that came before, but to the self that wrote it. You are no longer writing as you were. You're writing as who you become. Older, more cautious, a little more tired. And the story, it feels different now. Less alive, less urgent, less clear. And yet the reader still expects the fire. Still expects the same soul to pour through your hands, as if creativity were infinite, as if passion were renewable, as if every return to the world you built doesn't cost a piece of you. Dark Souls 2 is the expression of that exhaustion, codified into a kingdom. This is not a world at war. This is not a world in flames. This is a world that has been trying, quietly, to keep telling a story that it no longer believes in. The castles are still standing, but no one remembers who built them. The gods have names, but no faces. The songs still echo, but only as mechanisms to keep the dark from rising. Not because of faith, but because someone told them that that's what they must do. The people of Drangleic are not hopeful. They are bound by rhythm, by repetition. Like a writer, hunched over a manuscript they cannot abandon. But there is no closure. There's only continuation. And as you, the player, the author, the cursed, begin to walk the paths they walked, you don't uncover prophecy. You uncover compulsion. You don't rise, you loop. The very idea of ascension has been replaced with recursion. Every throne is empty not because the king has fallen, but because the king realized the seat itself was meaningless. And still you press on. You gather souls. You face bosses not to defeat evil, but to carry out rituals you were told were important, long after the meaning behind them has faded. You open doors because they're locked. You kill because something moves. You follow the path because it's laid out, even if no one remembers why it's there. And that's the unbearable weight of this story. It mimics the emotional experience of trying to write a sequel to a perfect first novel. You remember the beats, you remember the architecture, but nothing means what it used to. And no matter how hard you try, the manuscript falls apart in your hands. Not because you're careless, but because you are haunted. Haunted by expectation, haunted by legacy, and haunted by fire. This is where Dark Souls 2 becomes something transcendent. Not because it perfects the cycle, but because it dares to break the illusion of authorship. The illusion that we, as gamers, are in control. The illusion that the story always knows where they're going. That the page bends to our will rather than reflecting back our exhaustion, our fear, our reluctance to go out of the world we once loved creating. In Dark Souls 1, you choose between fire and dark. You were the myth's protagonist, the catalyst for an ancient cycle's rebirth or dissolution. The choice mattered because the structure held. But Dark Souls 2 doesn't offer a clean choice. It offers a diagnosis. You are cursed. Not because of your past, or your sins, or your greatness, but because you keep walking. Because you don't know how to stop. Because the story needs you, whether you believe in it or not. That's the horror. That's the heartbreak. And that is what it means to be the bearer of the curse. You do not rise, you do not conquer. You endure. You inherit a kingdom already hollowed by ideas that no longer apply, and you are asked to carry those ideas forward, not because they are right, but because they are there. That is your burden, not to shape the world, but to repeat its sentence. This is the quiet revelation of Dark Souls 2. The stories can die long before their words run out. The fire can still burn long after warmth has left it. That a myth can become a ritual, and a ritual can become a prison. The fire didn't fade. It just stopped meaning something. And in that silence, Dark Souls 2 whispers something devastatingly honest. You don't have to sit on the throne. You don't have to keep the story alive. You can, and probably should, just walk away. That's what makes this game, for all its messiness, its recursion, its dissonance, the most courageous entry in the entire series. Because it stares into the exhausted face of legacy and chooses not to blink. It lets the world go hollow. It lets the throne grow cold. And it lets you, the author, the reader, the cursed, decide whether this story is even worth finishing, or whether it's time to lay down the pen. And that is where we begin. Before anything else, Dark Souls 2 asks us to forget. There's no grand cathedral, no bells tolling overhead, no prophecy crackling in our ears. Just a yawning sky, a field of dead grass, and a world that doesn't seem to know we've arrived. We begin not in a kingdom, but in a blur. The things betwixt is not a tutorial, it's a eulogy. A threshold between what once was and what refuses to fade. The path is narrow, overgrown, and quiet in a way that doesn't feel peaceful. It feels like we're trespassing in someone else's ending. And maybe we are. The first souls we met are not gods or warriors or even people clinging to purpose. They're old women who laugh when they look at us. They don't see a hero. They see a symptom. A bearer of the curse. One more body washed up on the edge of a story that's already started over too many times. They asked for our name not because it matters, but because we've already forgotten it. This is the game's first and most important declaration. You are not a chosen one. You are a continuation. A product of recursion. The flame has been lit before, the kingdom has already fallen, and whatever you're about to do, it's not new. And yet we walk forward anyway, because that's what gamers have been trained to do. That's what we do. Pick up the sword, kill the thing, gather the souls, move to the next fog wall. Whether it's destiny, curiosity, or just habit, we step into the world expecting it to respond. But Drangleic doesn't respond. It endures. We arrive in Majula expecting structure, expecting the world to click into place. A safe zone, a blacksmith, a bonfire, a new fire link. But that familiarity is skin deep. Majula doesn't feel like home. It feels like the memory of one. The sun hangs too still in the sky. The music doesn't comfort. It wanders. Every structure is broken. Every inhabitant is on the edge of forgetting. The Emerald Herald stands near the cliff, repeating lines that sound like instructions, but feel like ritual. She's not guiding us, she's remembering how to. Her words don't welcome, they warn. She tells us to seek the king, not because he's waiting, but because he once mattered, because his name still echoes faintly in the rooms of this place. That's what Majula is, not a hub, but a grave marker. The game isn't beginning here, it's trying to begin again, and the first place it sends us is a forest filled with the dead. The forest of the fallen giants is the shape of war without meaning. Armored corpses dangle from trees, crumbling battlements spiral towards nothing. The enemies don't charge us with strategy or purpose, they lurch. Like their bones remember the fight, even if their minds have long since gone hollow. We descend through this place like archaeologists. We're not discovering a story. We're brushing dust off the aftermath of one. The giants we find are not invaders. They're victims of a war that made no sense to begin with. The king we hear whispers of, Vendrick, didn't defeat them. He endured them. And in doing so, he hollowed his kingdom as thoroughly as he hollowed himself. This is not a battlefield, it's a loop. And as gamers, we're expected to follow it. To slay the last remnants of a war no one remembers. To recover forgotten souls, not because we know what they're for, but because we were told we need them. And that's the real curse of Drangleic. Not undeath, not the flame, but the belief that we keep walking the path, maybe it will mean something again. If the Forest of the Fallen Giants was a memory of war, Hyde's Tower of Flame is the echo of worship. It rises from the sea like something sacred, but it doesn't feel holy. The architecture is white stone, bleached by the light of the sun, and that doesn't move. Everything gleams, everything shines, and everything is wrong. The light here is not divine, it is sterile. The guardians are not priests, they are statues with pulse. And they don't guard a temple, they simulate one. As gamers, we're used to progression having direction. Kill the boss, unlock the door, ascend towards climax. But Hyde doesn't escalate, it loops. It presents grandeur, but offers no clarity. You don't learn more about the kingdom. You don't uncover lore. You push forward simply because the architecture implies you should. That's where Dark Souls 2 begins to peel apart the illusion of design itself. It gives us the shape of something of meaning, without the soul. It lets us walk into rooms that feel important, even when they say nothing. It builds spaces so beautiful, so symmetrical, so precise, that we assume significance. But there is none. Because Hyde was not built to say something, it was built to remember something that was already lost. This is the pattern we begin to recognize. At No Man's Wharf, the theme deepens. Here, the game doesn't even pretend to offer divinity or purpose. It simply gives us decay. Creeping ships that no longer sail. Barnacle-covered decks, mobs of undead too feral to even posture as soldiers. There is no direction. There is no legacy. There is only rot and light. Because in No Man's Wharf, light hurts the enemies. Not because it's good, but because they've adapted to the dark. They're not evil. They're just exposed. And we are not heroes bringing illumination. We're intruders, kicking over the rocks where things have long since hidden to survive. But even the enemies here reflect the larger story. They're all dressed like sailors, warriors, refugees, from a battle we've never seen. And the boss? A pirate queen, alone in a shattered hull, clinging to her ship like it still matters. But it doesn't, because No Man's Wharf is not a story, it's a leftover. A failed crossing, a forgotten purpose, a port without destination. And so we press on, still hoping the next place will make it all connect. We arrive at the Lost Bastille, and here Dark Souls 2 makes its first full confession. This world was never designed to be understood. The Bastille is a prison, but the architecture is nonsensical. Cells lead to balconies, balconies to towers. Enemies explode. Dogs charge out of the dark. Doors open into arenas. Nothing flows, nothing escalates. The level isn't a metaphor, it's a breakdown. And as players, we begin to feel it. The exhaustion of the cycle. The tension of moving through a world built on remembered trauma. The guards don't protect prisoners. The prisoners don't seek freedom. No one is fighting for anything. They're just there. Because they always were. This is what makes the Lost Bastille such an important moment in the game. Not mechanically, but emotionally. It's the first place where we begin to question our own role. Why are we still fighting? Why are we lighting bonfires? Why do we need the next boss soul? The game doesn't answer. It can't. Because the world no longer remembers. Because meaning is not carried by narrative anymore. It's carried by momentum. And so we move forward. Not because we know what we're doing, but because something inside us is afraid to stop. Somewhere after Bastille, the world stops pretending to remember. You enter Huntsman's corpse, not through gates or fanfare, but through shadows. The sun no longer reaches those woods. The paths bend subtly, not to mislead, but because they've been walked so many times. The ground itself has forgotten which direction was forward. And this is where Dark Souls 2 stops imitating Lordran and begins hallucinating it. The corpse is littered with dead cultists, undead that worship rot, not as an end, but as a structure. They kneel before braziers, not gods. They burn corpses not in sacrifice, but in habit. It's not religious, it's recursive. They're not trying to escape the curse. They're trying to find meaning inside of it. And isn't that what we're doing too? As players, we're following the pattern that's before us. We explore, kill, light, level. But in this forest, the rhythm begins to feel wrong. Like we're still moving, but the drumbeat is off. Like the game is humming a song that doesn't match the tempo anymore. And what comes next? Poison. The descent into Harvest Valley is not framed as punishment. There's no dramatic music, no shift in tone. Just a quiet acceptance that the air itself is now death. Every step burns, every breath corrupts, and for once, there is no deeper metaphor, no moral lesson. The game simply says, this is the cost of moving forward. The enemies here don't hide, they stand in the open. Huge, bloated figures with sacks over their heads and toxin in their lungs. They are laborers of decay, not soldiers. They do not ambush you. They mine the poison. They maintain it. And suddenly, you're not in a fantasy world anymore. You're in a workplace. An industrial complex for rot. The implication is brutal. This is no longer a kingdom. This is a factory. The curse isn't resisted. It's harvested. The rot is not an accident. It is economy. As an author, this is where the story hits a terrifying rhythm. Because now we're not even dealing with myth. You're dealing with infrastructure. And when a fantasy world becomes maintenance instead of meaning, we've crossed a threshold few narratives are willing to approach. The climb into Earthen Peak is the next logical step, but not in a satisfying, coherent sense. We rise from the poison into a tower that produces it. A windmill, haunted and rusted, still turns. It pulls toxins upwards, spreads them across the valley, and in its chambers a woman waits. Not a queen, not a god, just a sorceress who bathes in the very venom her kingdom dies from. Maitha, the baneful queen. She is elegant, beautiful, headless. She fights you as if she still believes she's royalty, but she's not. She's the metaphor now. She is what happens when love curdles into obsession, when identity outlasts form, when ritual continues long after the reason for it has died. And we kill her. Not out of narrative urgency, but because she's in the way. That's what makes this part of the game so quietly devastating. By this point, we no longer expect meaning from these fights. We're not lighting flames to stave off darkness. We're not ringing bells to restore balance. We're just following the thread. One fall gate to the next. Because if we stop now, we'll have to admit we've been hollow this whole time. Next comes Iron Keep, where logic dies completely. We climb a windmill and arrive in a castle surrounded by lava. No elevation makes sense. No path connects. The moment you step inside, the world stops caring whether it does. Because Iron Keep isn't a place. It's an eruption. It is the moment the story catches fire. Not in metaphor, but in structure. Everything burns. The architecture is violence. The enemies are armored to the point of parody. The soundtrack roars not with dread, but with resignation. As if even the game knows, this part was written in someone else's hand. As a writer, Iron Keep reminds me of that chapter we all bury. The one that just doesn't fit. The one we wrote out of duty, not inspiration. And yet it remains, stubborn and proud. A testament to the idea that sometimes, stories don't continue because they must. They continue because we're too afraid to stop them. At some point in every story, the descent becomes literal. We've climbed towers, crossed battlefields, burned our way through castles, but the further we progress in Dark Souls 2, the more the game stops pretending there's something to ascend toward. And so, finally, it points us downward. We enter the Grave of Saints not through grandeur, but through rot, a hidden hole behind the bonfire, a great door. No herald, just a gap in the wall that swallows light as much as it swallows hope. This is where the bones pile, where the discarded are kept. The NPCs here speak in cryptic tones, not out of mystery, but because they no longer speak with memory. This is where the game admits the truth. The curse doesn't lead somewhere. It sinks. There are no great cities below. There's no promised kingdom in the roots. There's just the gutter. A name that doesn't pretend. A place built not to be remembered, but to be avoided. The gutter is architecture's apology, a stacked, twisted, fragile structure that looks less like it was built and more like it collapsed inward over centuries. Everything feels unsound. The ground creaks, the ladders groan. You descend not with courage, but with obligation, because you've come too far to turn back. As players, we keep walking. Because there must be something at the bottom. There must be. We light our torches, we edge across beams, we fight creatures that don't defend territory, they cling to it. Because the gutter doesn't attract enemies, it creates them. This is where the forgotten stories are kept, where mechanics falter, where lore becomes sludge. The curse lives down here, not as a philosophical force, but as a disease, and we carry it willingly. Because to stop now would be to admit we've been chasing nothing. We fall again, deeper still, and land in the Black Gulch. Here the game removes all pretense of exploration. You're no longer discovering, you are surviving. The walls close in, giant stone faces belch poison from every surface. The torches barely hold. The enemies don't patrol, they wait, as if they knew someone would come eventually. As if they've killed 1,000 just like you. And then we meet the Rotten. There is no throne, no chamber, no dramatic fog gate, just an enormous, silent heap of corpses. He doesn't roar, he doesn't monologue. He reaches for you, not like a predator, but like a child afraid you'll take away the only thing he remembers how to hold. And here finally, the truth sets in. We're not slaying evil. We're not restoring balance. We're not progressing. We are processing grief. This entire descent, from the grave to the gutter to the gulch, is a funeral march. Not for the world, for the narrative. For the idea that this journey was ever about glory. And as an author, I recognize that march. There comes a point in every story where the myth breaks down, where the structure decays, where the characters stop behaving, where the world won't hold together no matter how tightly you write. And that's where we are now. This isn't world design anymore. This is the story's nervous breakdown. Eventually, even descent becomes directionless. After facing the rotten, after dragging ourselves through a mire of ash, bones, and bile, the game doesn't reward us with clarity. It doesn't even acknowledge what we've done. It simply nudges us sideways, into the shaded woods. And in that shift, the tone changes completely. This isn't a descent or a climb. It's a blur. A space between concepts, between identities. A forest that forgot how to be a forest. Past spirals in on themselves. Fog cloaks everything in a gray indistinction. Enemies fade from view. Even our own silhouette begins to betray you. Attacked not by creatures, but by memories in motion. As players, we've grown used to ambiguity in FromSoftware worlds. But this is the first time it feels intentional. Not mysterious, but wounded. As though the forest itself is trying to remember how it used to be part of a story, but it no longer trusts its own perspective. There's no castle here, no lord. There's just movement. A kingdom pacing in its sleep, and the player's only real guidance, a mirror. Not a relic, not a gateway, a literal mirror. Because the shaded woods aren't leading us anywhere. They're turning us inward. You leave the fog, only to enter space defined by misdirection, the doors of pharaohs. An area less built around exploration and more around confusion. There are switches, contraptions, enemies who appear too large for the space. It feels like a testing ground, or an attic. A space cramped with things that developers didn't want to throw away but didn't know how to place. And so as gamers, we wander. We activate faith stones. We unlock useless rooms. We fight an enormous rat king who speaks of covenant and territory. But it never lands. Not because it isn't clever, but because it isn't relevant. This entire region plays like a footnote in a manuscript that's already past its climax. And yet we continue. Because Brightstone Cove is just beyond it. And Brightstone Cove feels, for a brief moment, like a return to something grounded. There is a village, there is a cult, there is a rhythm of sacrifice and corruption. The visual language is clear. Cobwebs, sunken homes, villagers gone mad. We begin to feel like we're back in Dark Souls again. There is intention, there is theme. But what makes Seldora truly haunting is what it mimics. It's not Lordran, it's Blighttown, it's Ulasil, it's the Painted World. It's the corrupted outpost of a forgotten age. It wears the same mask, but it speaks in a different dialect. It's quieter, more fragmented. The enemies behave like echoes, delayed, unnatural, and wrong. And in the deepest part of the web, past skittering spiders and shrouded clergy, we find Freya. Not a god, not a monarch, just a creature that grew too large for its cage. And beneath her corpse we find something worse. A great soul. Not because she earned it, but because the story needed a placeholder. As an author, this is where the dread sharpens. Because we've reached the moment where structure becomes substitution. Where boss fights aren't about escalation, they're about maintenance. The story doesn't evolve, it fills space. Like patching a plot hole in someone else's ending. Like laying down bones just to prove the skeleton is still standing. Freya is not a character. She's a punctuation mark, and her death doesn't unlock meaning, it unlocks mechanism. A fragment of a path, a name you're told to collect, a step in a process that no longer explains itself. We're not heroes anymore, we're scribes of a dying format, still walking because walking is all we've been taught to do. When we arrive at Drangleic Castle, it feels like we've reached the center. Not the geographical center, but the emotional one. The place the story has been gesturing toward without quite knowing how. There's no victory march, no grand reveal, just rain pouring down in sheets that seem to flatten the world beneath them. The air is heavy, the sky doesn't roar, it sighs. And for the first time, the architecture speaks clearly. The walls are massive but tired. The doors are wide but reluctant. Statues line the courtyard. Stone men lock in poses that seem both noble and afraid. And when you step too close, they awaken. Not because they are waiting, because they're designed to. Drangleic Castle is where the metaphor of the game finally becomes literal. This isn't a kingdom, it's a machine. A ritual engine. Each hallway triggers a response. Each kill unlocks a door. Enemies bleed into alcoves to power mechanisms you don't understand. Nothing moves unless you feed it souls. The castle does not reward exploration, it requires sacrifice. And that's when the illusion begins to collapse for good. Because by this point, we as gamers have become numb to cause and effect. We've killed bosses who didn't guard anything. We've lit bonfires out of habit. And now we're walking through a palace that no longer even pretends to have narrative logic. Vendrick, the king we've heard so much about, is nowhere near his throne. He's in a crypt, naked, silent, wandering. But we'll come back to him. First, we descend again, because just outside the castle, past a shrine of pillars and forgettable battles, lies a place so gorgeous it almost breaks the spell. The Shrine of Romana. A glowing pool, crystal waters, a chorus of soft voices singing not to welcome you, but to keep something quiet. This place isn't dangerous in the traditional sense. It's dangerous because it feels sacred, because we lower our guard, because we want to believe that maybe, just maybe, beauty means safety again. But it doesn't. The shrine is a trap, not for the player, for the story. It is the fantasy world trying to resurrect itself through artifice, through music, through the illusion that if the water glows bright enough, we'll forget what brought us here. And then, after enough death, after enough drowned corpses, you'll find the path downward to the undead crypt. And here, the story stops whispering. It begins to moan. The crypt is everything the game has been avoiding. Finality, closure, death with permanence. The walls don't crumble, they suppress. The enemies are slow, mournful, deliberate. They don't want to kill you, they want to keep you. This is where Vendrick wanders. Not as a ruler, not even as a man. As a ghost of an idea. He doesn't attack, he doesn't speak. He simply walks around a coffin again and again and again. As a player, you can ignore him, but you don't. You feel like maybe he's the answer. Maybe this broken, silent monarch knows something. But he doesn't. He was the king who tried to outthink the curse, who tried to break the story, and in doing so, he shattered himself. His memory is kept alive only by the things that can't forget him. His guards, his walls, his enemies. And now, you carry that burden. Because the game doesn't reward you for finding Vendrick. It leaves you with a question. And then, if you've followed every side path, if you've gathered enough of the past, you unlock the final truth. Aldia, the scholar, the heretic, the brother. He does not greet you with anger or ceremony. He appears in bursts, through flame, through root, through memory. His voice is distorted not by malice, but by conflict. He is what remains of a character who tried to rewrite the story while still trapped inside of it. Aldia doesn't fight for power. He fights for meaning. He isn't trying to destroy the curse. He's trying to understand why it exists. He's the only character in the entire Souls trilogy who steps outside the narrative long enough to ask the hardest question a player or a writer can face. What if the story isn't broken? What if the need for a story is the real curse? As an author, I've never seen a character like Aldia in a game before. He's not a villain, he's not a mentor, he is the editor. He dares us to put down the pen. By now, we've been stripped of expectations. We've seen kings reduced to silence, kingdoms twisted into factories, gods replaced by roots and rot, and we still walk. Not to glory, but because the walk is all we have left. And that's when the game sends us somewhere absurd. To the dragons. It feels almost mythic, like a return to primal storytelling. The dragon Eyrie glows with light, winds stir ancient feathers, stone bridges coil above chasms. But unlike other moments of spectacle in the Souls series, this place does not challenge us with fire or philosophy. It dares us to stop walking, because there's nothing here we were promised. No major bosses, no world-defining secret, just dragons, waiting. Not roaring, not hunting, watching. We reach the ancient dragon and it speaks, not in violence, but in memory. And what it gives us isn't power. It gives us a feather, a key to the past. And suddenly, we're not moving forward anymore. We're stepping backward, into time itself, into the memories of ancients. These are not levels, they are echoes. The game tells us you can only stay for a moment. The world rejects your presence. You're not meant to be here, but you have to be. Because if Drangleic cannot offer truth, maybe the past can. And so we revisit the fall of the giants, not to fix anything, but to witness it. The fire still burns, the kingdom still crumbles, our presence is irrelevant. That is what makes this sequence so powerful. They remove you from the role of actor and reduce you to what you were all along, a reader, of a history that no longer belongs to you, of a story whose author is long dead. And then the journey ends where all stories that have lost their voice must end, the throne of want. There's no lead up, no crescendo, just a fall gate and a stone room. Inside, two faceless enemies, mirrors of yourself, shadows of every choice you didn't make. There is no great revelation, no Guinevere, no serpent, just silence. And then, the throne itself, the ultimate symbol of narrative structure. The seat says, here is where the story ends. But we already know better, because when you sit, nothing is resolved. If you link the fire, it burns again. For now. If you walk away, you vanish. Either way, the cycle continues. Unless you found Aldia, unless you let him speak, unless you faced him, flame-twisted and unkillable. And then, and only then, does a game offer you something truly rare. A third path. Not light, not dark, but refusal. You can reject the throne. You can say no. You can step away from the circle. And the game, brilliantly, devastatingly, offers no answers to what happens next. Because Dark Souls 2 is not about solving the curse. It's about recognizing the moment when meaning stops being honest. It's about understanding that some stories go hollow, and some thrones are not worth sitting on. Every great story carries a seed of its own end. It builds tension, it introduces conflict, and then, if the structure holds, it offers resolution. It closes a circle. It leaves the reader changed, or at peace, or broken in a meaningful way. But Dark Souls 2 refuses this rhythm. It begins already after the ending. The circle is already broken. The fire has already been lit, and relit, and resisted. We are not players stepping into a myth. We are intruders, passing on a narrative that has already hollowed. As an author, I've come to fear this place. Not because it's dark, but because it's familiar. Dark Souls 2 is what happens when you try to write inside the runes of a story you did not begin. It is a literary condition of the sequel, when the ink is still drying on someone else's masterpiece, and the publisher asks you for more. More fire, more gods, more thrones. But the author is tired. The world doesn't need more. The world needs to end, and yet, we walk anyway. The bearer of the curse isn't a mythic pilgrim. They are not chosen by fate. They are chosen by absence. By the hole left behind when Gwyn vanished. When the cycle became doctrine. When the fire and dark stopped meaning anything and started to be obligations. The curse is not on death. It's a recurrence. And every player who lights the bonfire, every writer who picks up the pen, every voice that tries to continue the story after its climax, carries that curse. This is why Dark Souls 2 speaks to me more as a writer than any other game in the series, because it doesn't celebrate the act of storytelling. It mourns it. Drangleic is not Lordran's successor. It is Lordran's ghost. And the characters we meet are not living. They are echoes of roles that once had meaning. Lucatiel, the wandering knight who speaks of honor, as if the word were a thread she's wrapping around her own soul. Vendrick, the broken king who tried to understand the structure of the curse like a student breaking down a sentence. Aldia, the scholar who saw the story for what it was and tried to walk off the page. None of them succeed, because this is not a story about escape. This is a story about refusal. Not dramatic, not loud, but deeply, painfully literary. It's what happens when the story no longer believes in itself, but keeps going out of momentum. Because the pen is still moving. Because the world still turns. Because the throne still stands. Even when no one wants to sit on it. In most stories, structure is the skeleton that keeps everything standing. Acts, beats, arcs, rising tension, climaxes, payoff. As writers, we learn these bones early. We are taught that even chaos must fit. Even darkness must resolve. But in Dark Souls 2, structure has become a carcass. Something that used to move, now taxidermied into place. The 4 great souls aren't earned, they're assigned. The throne isn't earned, it's expected. The fire isn't lit, it's rehearsed. As an author, this is the moment that terrifies me, when I begin writing not to discover something new, but to fulfill a shape I've already seen before. When the story becomes obligation, when the climax becomes choreography, Dark Souls 2 doesn't reject this. It documents it. The entire game is structured like a writer trying to mimic the brilliance of their predecessor, repeating the bones of Lordran by rearranging its limbs. A poisoned swamp here, a ghost-infested tower there, a castle at the midpoint, a ruined capital, a crypt, a dragon, a king, a lie. But something is always off. The world doesn't connect the way it used to. Bonfires feel arbitrary. Key items feel placed, not discovered. Characters speak in riddles because they no longer remember what it was they were supposed to say. And yet, it works. Because the game isn't about coherence. It's about memory. And memory doesn't preserve structure. It distorts it. This is why so many locations in Dark Souls 2 feel like a dream of better places. Why Hyde's Tower of Flame feels like Anor Londo but hollowed out. Why Sildor feels like Ulasil but collapsed into dust. Why the Iron Keep burns like Izalith but offers no flame of its own. We're not walking a world, we're walking a reflection of one. But reflections don't offer truth, they offer ritual, and ritual, in this game, has begun to rot. From the beginning, fire was meant to be sacred, a symbol of power, of warmth, of choice. But in Dark Souls 2, fire is currency. Bonfires are checkpoints. Flame is automation. There's no ceremony when we link the fire. There's no awe, only mechanism. We pull the lever, we trigger the animation. The cycle continues. As if the story were a loop that no longer needed a writer. And that's the final wound Dark Souls 2 opens in authors. The fear that narrative, once beautiful, can become system. That we no longer tell stories to understand, but to maintain. That the fantasy world we love has become a content machine. And we were just one more voice feeding its due. There comes a point in every story, if it lives long enough, when the hero should walk away. But most don't. Most fall into myth, into obligation, into endings so tightly wound they suffocate with the possibility of anything else. But Dark Souls 2, in its strangest and most brilliant stroke, offers that exit. It comes in the form of a flickering flame, a twisted voice, and a character who barely counts as a man anymore. Aldia. He is not the villain. He is not a savior. He is not a foil to Gwen or a rival to Nashandra. He is the other. He is a corrupted result of a thinker who stared too long at the bones of a story and began to ask questions we weren't supposed to ask. Why do we link the fire? Why must the curse persist? Why does the story demand a throne? He burns because the world rejected him, because knowledge, when pursued beyond the bounds of myth, becomes something dangerous, something heretical, something honest. And so, in his final confrontation, not just a boss fight but a thesis, Aldia lays bare the heart of the curse. It's not undeath, it's compulsion. You are cursed because you cannot help but continue. You must keep walking. You must defeat the final boss. You must sit on the throne. Because what else is there? This is what makes Dark Souls 2 revolutionary, not mechanically, not visually, but philosophically. It builds a game around a story that is trying to reject itself. It places in your path a voice that whispers not seduction, but resistance. And when the end comes, when Nashandra and her shadows fall, when the fall gate fades, you do not have to sit. You can turn, you can leave, and the game allows it. The screen fades not with fanfare, but uncertainty. No prophecy fulfilled, no kingdom reborn. Just you, walking away. As an author, that moment stuck with me harder than any final battle ever could. Because it is the rarest thing in storytelling. A narrative that lets go. Not out of failure, but out of grace. It doesn't need to justify itself. It doesn't demand applause. It simply stops. And in that stillness, it trusts you, the gamer, the reader, to understand what it could not say. That some stories aren't meant to be finished. That some cycles aren't meant to be unbroken. That sometimes, the bravest act of all, is not to keep the fire alive, but to walk away from it.